I should say, so I'm walking in from time to
You're
time.
live now?
The worst.
No, maybe.
Well, my point was that sponsors were standing up saying, I'm gonna vote for the bill, but I don't like this aspect of it.
Spend a week, send a break. So want to get started here. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, Thursday, July 25th. And we have 4 rules today. But before we get started, we'll do introductions. So I always start to my left.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Morning, everyone.
Good morning, Chris Brave from Bristol, Vermont, representing the Addison Senate District.
Good morning, Senator Dave Weeks, representing Rutland County.
Yeah, and Mark Higley from Lowell, representing the Orleans Lamoille District.
Representative Carol Odie from the New North End of Burlington.
Senator Mark McDonald, representing most of the towns in Orange County.
And Representative Trevor Squirrel, I represent Underhill and Jericho. And walking in the room is,
Bob Rights, representing Bennington Four.
and supporting us,
Nancy Schreier, Administrative Assistant.
welcome everyone. First order of business are the minutes of June 27, 24. Questions, edits? Senator Bray?
I would move approval of the minutes of the June 27, 2024 meeting.
Additional discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Okay, first rule we have today is 23P43, Agency of Natural Resources, Vermont Low Emission Vehicle and Zero Emission Vehicle Rules. Rachel Stevens, Associate General Counsel, Department of Environmental Conservation, Agency of Natural Resources, will be speaking for the agency. And here, oh, is that the?
Yep.
Yeah, join us up there, Will.
Morning. For the record, I'm Rachel Stevens, Associate General Counsel at Agency of Natural Resources. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Deirdre Ritzer, who's the Mobile Sources Section Chief for the Air Quality and Climate Division. She's our technical expert and implements the rules that we're going to be discussing today. So we'll start with Deirdre giving a brief overview of the 3 minor amendments that we're proposing, and we'll be available to answer any questions.
Good morning, I'm Deirdre Ritzer with the Agency of Natural Resources. And ANR is proposing 3 minor amendments to Vermont's low and zero emission vehicle rules, which incorporate by reference. Do I have to speak? So ANR is proposing 3 minor amendments to Vermont's low and zero emission vehicle rules, which incorporate by reference California's heavy duty engine and vehicle omnibus regulation, also known as the heavy duty omnibus regulation. ANR previously adopted the heavy duty omnibus regulation in 2022, and it is in effect today. The regulation sets standards for emissions of the air pollutants, nitrogen oxides or NOx, and particulate matter from on-road heavy-duty engines used in vehicles delivered for sale in Vermont, which help to protect public health and the air quality in Vermont. These requirements are imposed on vehicle manufacturers, not small businesses or individuals. Vehicle and engine manufacturers are currently required to deliver compliant vehicles and engines starting with vehicle model year 2026, but they can also earn compliance credits for delivering compliant vehicles earlier than that. I'll walk through each of the 3 amendments now, and these amendments are also described in detail in the technical support document. The first proposed amendment clarifies the existing language exempting diesel fueled transit buses and engines from the regulation by adding this vehicle type to the exemption list in Chapter 40-103D. The original transit bus exemption ANR included in the regulation is problematic as written because it relies on conditions specific to California, regulations that were not adopted in Vermont. So this amendment adds clarity and has no economic or environmental impacts. The second proposed amendment adjusts the vehicle model year by which manufacturers can begin accruing early compliance credits from 2024 to 2022. Allowing early credit generation beginning in model year 2022 is consistent with California and the other states that have adopted the regulation. A&R also received a specific request for this amendment from a vehicle manufacturer impacted by the regulation and currently developing their compliance plan. Because this proposed amendment does not change the emission standards manufacturers are already required to comply with under the regulation, there are no economic or environmental impacts. The third proposed amendment incorporates an optional compliance flexibility negotiated by California and the truck and engine manufacturers to assure engine availability. The proposal allows manufacturers to produce legacy engines that meet today's federal standards instead of the more stringent heavy-duty omnibus standards for model year 2026. The proposed amendment maintains the originally projected emission reductions of the regulation because any emissions from the legacy engines must be offset. This amendment has a $0 net economic impact over the lifetime of the regulation because the cost to offset any excess emissions is expected to equal the technology cost savings from producing the legacy engines in model year 2026. These three proposed amendments are minor changes, but important to maintain consistency with California's standards and will ensure a smoother transition for vehicle and engine manufacturers required to comply with the heavy-duty omnibus regulations. The amendments do not increase emissions, change the stringency of the existing rule, or add any cost to manufacturers or small businesses. And Rachel and I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Committee? Senator McDonald.
Issuing credits to legacy engines. When you issue a credit, in theory, that credit is being used not to have to do something else. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, this is an optional flexibility that's going to allow for that only in model year 2026.
So if you are allowed to continue to use or build new legacy engines to repair vehicles, is that what this deals with?
This would be for new vehicles that are being manufactured in that model year, that they can be made to the federal standard for model year 2026.
Well, we're not, the rule is not federal standards, it's
Yep.
California and Vermont standards.
Yep.
So we're allowing the continued manufacture and putting into service of the older, less clean engines in exchange for doing what?
So the engines, the legacy engines, they're capped at 10% of the manufacturer's sales in 2026. So it's very limited, and it's just to provide some flexibility to ensure it's kind of like, it could be seen as like a phasing in of the rule where 90% of the vehicles need to meet the rule, but in 2026, but only 10% don't have to. And then 2027, it's 100%.
So when we use the term flexibility, we're adding up one column and giving it some extra numbers so that the other column doesn't have the numbers in it that would be problematic for manufacturing.
I think so. But the excess emissions produced by those legacy engines, those 10% legacy engines, have to be offset. And vehicle manufacturers can offset by providing zero emission vehicles, and they can get credit for that.
So if I may wrap up by saying my understanding is that, yes, you can replace the dirtier old engines for the next several years, provided that the new clean engines balance out the older dirty engines that are going to be phased out over a period of time. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, yeah, I would say that's fair. And then, because for 2026, as Deirdre said, it's kind of giving a little bit more of an on-ramp for the change.
Well, I take it as being a yes, and that's what is being proposed for us to approve.
Yes, and to be clear, also California reviewed and considered that change and negotiated that with manufacturers. And so that's already been adopted in California, which is one of the reasons why we're adopting it as well in Vermont.
So, Mr. Chair, what is being proposed makes sense to me. In the presentation, the witnesses talk about flexibility, and I don't know whether that's the flexibility of trapeze artists or it has to do with older polluting stuff and neat and cleaner stuff. And you've worked out the balance that there's no loss to the environment by this flexibility.
Yes, that's a fair point. And
Thank you very much.
yeah, and I appreciate the vocabulary, some of the vernacular used by manufacturers. So I appreciate that that's maybe
Thank you.
a common understanding.
Senator Bray.
Good morning. Thanks for coming over. I just wanted to understand a little better. I'm citing a phrase in the cover sheet, page 5, where it talks about the cost to offset emission is estimated to be equal to the technology cost savings. So how is it, who spells out what the costs are and then quantifies that and publishes that, so that when it sounds like there's a cost to emissions,
Mhm.
and as I understand it, we're saying that the cost to upgrade engines is being offset by reducing emissions that have a cost associated with them. So it's a balancing out. And I'm just wondering, where is the cost expressed, both sides, for developing the emissions implications and what they cost? Then
Are you asking about like where in the record, like our rule record?
I don't know if it's in your record or if you rely on the California record, but we're often, as we're doing climate related work, data can become controversial. I'm just trying to understand where that data is expressed.
You can jump in if I'm wrong, but I think the incorporation, what we've incorporated is by reference is the economic analysis produced by CARB, which we've listed, I think in our technical support document. I can pull that up for the page site. And I think we have a summary in our technical support document as well.
So, and it's not, I don't want to sidetrack us too much on it. It
No,
could be
I
that after the meeting too, if
Yeah.
there's more
So this,
that you would like to point to or something like that.
yeah, so for page 8 of the technical support document, we have listed here, it's because we're in an unusual situation where we're incorporating the California standards. We've incorporated by reference their rule record and referred to that and summarized that in our rule record in the technical document. So that economic, kind of the net zero explanation of the costs to emit is in the omnibus final statement of reasons, which I should have numbered these, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Bullet 8, the omnibus addendum to the final statement of reasons, and then the final statement of reasons. That's the name that CARB uses for their APA rule record. And then we've summarized here on page 7 of our technical support document, citing to that as well. I could bring my computer up and we could pull that up too, if that would be helpful.
So I'm happy to follow offline. I just figured this is going to be an ongoing conversation, what the negative externalities are, what the value is, how we offset them. And I just thought I'd want to check in while this important rule is going.
And I think for this economic cost analysis, we're assessing the cost to a manufacturer to comply with our regulations. So when we're talking about net zero, we're saying that we think the economic cost, or the analysis is that the economic cost to a manufacturer will be a net zero because they're saving by we're allowing that extra 10% of the legacy engines, the ones that meet the federal standards, not our more stringent standards, but then they have to also offset those environmental costs, so it kind of comes out as equal.
And then the other thing is we followed California since 1996. Can you just say a little bit about where we have flexibility where we don't in terms of, it seems like the point of this rulemaking is to add some of that flexibility and then it localizes the rules.
Yeah, typically there's a case or there's some case law about this, but typically we have to follow the stringency of the requirements and the standards. So we don't, there's only two sets of standards in the country, obviously California and the federal standards. So we don't have flexibility for that, but where we do have flexibility is some of the maybe implementation questions about like reporting and how reports are formatted, or, different states have different processes. We also have enforcement discretion, which every state maintains for our regulations. So for example, if a manufacturer, like across all the states that have adopted the California standards, is having trouble complying, we would have to have a meeting, we'd have to talk about that, we'd have to assess, enforcement, and we could exercise enforcement discretion or figure out how to work through that. So those are the kind of the implementation enforcement realm is where we have a little bit more flexibility, but in terms of stringency, standards, or in this case, an allowance that CARB is going to allow, we would also need to provide that compliance option.
So much.
Yeah, thanks.
Senator Weeks.
Just a question on implementation. I'm curious if the engine OEM, the engine manufacturers at this point are seen to be able to meet these CARB goals for 2026, 2027. Do you have insight into that?
Well, that was definitely the source of what resulted in this negotiated agreement was outreach by manufacturers that had assessed the landscape of states that had adopted omnibus, said to CARB, there were several meetings between the federal EMA, Engine Manufacturers Association, and CARB about the omnibus, looking at the landscape. And I think we've actually linked to the actual settlement. But the result was this, just for 2026, this is kind of the request that we received. So that was the response was, looking at their compliance. And manufacturers, they set up their compliance plans many years in advance, which is why we have to do 2-year lead time on our rules. So they have a lot of runway. So far, this is all we've been informed is kind of like the flexibility, but we're going to continue to assess as we get closer to our compliance date for 26.
Okay, good. Any indicators then about 2027?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, we're reverting back to the federal, is that
No,
right?
it's aligning with the federal
Aligning.
requirements. So
Yeah.
it will be essentially nationwide.
Yeah, so meaning that the CARB stringency of the standards in model year 2027 will be the same as the federal standards for that year for now. And the reason why it's, these provisions also affect other states that adopted in 24 and 25. Obviously, we've only adopted for 2026. But this kind of on-ramp for other states that adopted sooner. So it may seem odd to make a change for 1 year, but other states have made this change for the 3 years.
And in the package, you indicate that there's no effect on small businesses. Engine OEMs will have increased costs to adhere to the more stringent pollution requirements, which then they pass on to consumers. It's just the way business works. How can you say that the net impact is zero for the small business folks in purchasing future heavy vehicles?
Meaning it should include the idea that a vehicle may be more expensive
Sure.
to a consumer. Yeah.
I think what we're saying is compared to the rule that's already on the books, these amendments aren't increasing costs based on that. But in 2022, we did discuss the whole cost and economic impacts.
Okay, so in 2026 and 2027, small businesses still have a zero cost impact. Is that anticipated?
Oh, that's a good point. Actually, sorry, that's why you're here because she's our expert. This amendment will not have an increase because this amendment is allowing flexibility, but there was an economic cost to the original rule, which was adopted in 2022. So that's what Deirdre was referring to, that we had a detailed assessment of the economic cost to businesses when we adopted the original rule in 2022, which as you may recall was a really robust process. We had meetings across the state. But so here the economic assessment is just on the impact of the amendments to the existing regulation, which is already in the books. Yeah, thank you for catching.
Representative Hickman.
Thank you. and Thank you for being here. Just want to follow up a little bit more on some of that questioning. How many other states are following the California standards?
Overall, or for the omnibus?
I guess for the omnibus.
Off the top of my head, no.
7,
Yeah, I was gonna say 8, 9.
7. We can check.
7.
It's on, it's online.
That's fine. I guess my point there is I can certainly understand if you've got two sets of standards across the country, how a manufacturer is going to adjust for that. I mean, and again, I think, going further, there was some comments by the American Bus Association, which, seemed to have some legitimate concerns. It seems like A&R addressed those concerns, but were they appeased by what your answers were?
I mean, I think that I would hope so. I mean, I do think that there was a lot of discussion about the original omnibus proposal because the California standard is more stringent than the federal standard, but that's a conversation that was happening nationwide. And our agency was directed to adopt these rules in 2022 to meet our ambitious targets. So, but in terms of being able to implement and to, these amendments are an effort to make the transition smoother. So we're allowing early compliance credits 2 years sooner, and then that legacy engine kind of offset for this first year. And then we'll be back to alignment. So in terms of impact, it's not like it's, for 2026, it is a more stringent standard. But I'm hopeful that we've kind of addressed those concerns as best we can. But that's the reality, is that we're a California state. We adopt more stringent air quality standards for vehicles.
And I would like to add that it does sound like, 7 states maybe isn't a lot. But the states that have adopted include New York and some larger states. So it is a larger percentage of the heavy duty vehicle sales in the nation. So it is a pretty substantial amount.
So I guess getting back to the question of those 7 states, and they may be a larger number of fleet vehicles in those states. How are the manufacturers, again, going to adjust for making sure that those states that have the higher standards get the vehicles that they need?
I mean, that's an ongoing conversation. I mean, for example, we were just on a phone call yesterday with all of the major auto manufacturers about another rule that's not on the discussion today. And we had a really robust discussion about how it's going, how, they're making their compliance plans in advance. So it's a regular conversation. It's not just we adopt the rules and then we step away. We're in regular communication with those manufacturers, including CARB. So we're all a part of those conversations. The group of states, more broadly, I think is about 14 or 16 that have adopted California standards, are called the Section 177 states. And we have regular meetings with CARB and manufacturers to make sure they understand the requirements, to make sure they understand, how they can comply and if there's any issues. So I feel like we have as a coalition of states, have a good pulse on how it's going, and try to be really mindful of that, because we want to make sure that they can comply. And if there are issues or things that need to be fixed, or realities in the marketplace, that we're aware of that with plenty of time. So I guess that's the best I can do, is to say that we have regular conversations about it. But it is true that there's 2 sets of cars in the United States.
Right.
So.
All right, thank you.
Members? Senator Reeds?
Yeah, so in the package, there's a pretty good summary from American Bus Association, and you responded appropriately, I think, to those. But in the package, there's also mention of the Truck and Engine Manufacturer Association and then the Vermont Truck and Bus Association. I'm wondering if they gave any feedback on the development of this rule. Because it's not in the package. I'm wondering if they were offered the opportunity but just declined.
You're saying the engine?
Yeah, there's a Truck and Engine Manufacturer Association. And there's a Vermont Truck and Bus Association, which were mentioned in the package, but there's not feedback.
Yeah, so we did do additional outreach beyond just the standard public notice because we had done such a robust set of stakeholder engagement when we adopted the original rule, including an informational stakeholder meeting with all the truck and bus associations. Deirdre did a presentation at their, annual meeting. So we did all of that like direct outreach for the original rule package for omnibus. And then we included the notices in our email list for this update. And so the only entity that attended our public meeting and provided comments in writing was the American Bus Association. So these were the only comments that we received in writing or during the meeting, but we did do direct outreach and have maintained relationships with those groups. Yeah. I guess one other thing I might say is that I think that because these amendments reflect the advocacy of the Federal EMA Association, my impression is that it aligns with the general feedback.
So thank you.
We have another follow-up question. When you said you were directed to follow the California standards, by whom? Was it the Global Warming Solutions Act?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, just to be clear, I'm sorry, I'm trying to be concise, but also be accurate. But we've adopted in Vermont the California standards since 1996. So that's for really good air quality reasons and emissions reasons. The omnibus in particular, and a few other, the Advanced Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Trucks, and the truck and trailer rule that we adopted in 2022, those were incorporated in the climate action plan. But the Lev and Zev rule as in terms of adopting California cars, that's been in place since the 90s.
Thank you.
Great.
So on behalf of Senate Natural, I signed off on the rule. I just wanted to say that. And also I'd like to move approval of Rule 23P43, Agency of Natural Resources, Vermont Low Emission Vehicle and Zero Emission Vehicle Rules.
Senator Bray has got a motion to approve the rule. Any additional conversation, discussion? Tom?
So, it's been an interesting discussion about trucks, and it tends to, I believe, being centered on pickup trucks as being the flashpoint here.
Yeah, these bills impact, it's our heavy duty fleet for this role.
Well, we've all seen the pickup truck that pulls the diesel railroad locomotive on television. So if this rule passes, Vermonters will still be able to buy pickup trucks that are 1,300 pounds more heavy than they used to be 10 years ago and are capable of pulling electric diesel locomotives as we've seen on TV.
Yes, this is not our electrification rule. This is just our NOx, nitrogen oxide tweaks to the engines that are manufactured. This is an electric.
So in the manufacture of these new cleaner engines being built in order to permit the older, dirtier engines to continue to function as long as the pickup truck bodies are able to, not rust out and
Yes.
be available.
Yep,
That will not, the price that we're talking about is the manufacture of the engine, not the arbitrary pricing of pickup trucks, which I think the markup is somewhere between $12,000 and $14,000 on the manufacturer's suggested price for the average, four-door pickup truck on the market today. But the companies will still be able to put a sticker price on it that they feel is in their best interests, not necessarily the value of the manufacturing the engines.
I think that's fair to say. And I think this is also the commercial market in terms of these. And yeah, these aren't like, I don't think any of us are, this is the commercial, like heavy duty vehicles.
What I keep reading is it's those vehicles are the darlings that have replaced the Corvettes and the other vehicles that people used to buy that for the pleasure of buying them as opposed to the actual, who needs a Corvette to take your kids to soccer practice?
Yeah, I think you could visualize like the semi on a highway, semi truck.
Thank you for helping us see the line here. That this is a limited technical rule and doesn't to any degree influence or change the current attitude towards such vehicles for reasons other than cleanliness and efficiency.
Yeah, I would characterize these as minor tweaks to the rule that we adopted in 2022 to try to make, we've been using kind of to make the on-ramp a little smoother to.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Representative Bogart.
I will move the adoption of 23.
We have a motion.
Yeah.
Oh, so did you move it?
You do wheel.
A little more.
I didn't pick up on that. Okay.
I'm gonna,
Well, I'm with you.
I'm gonna have to. Yeah, just-
Yeah, that's a second.
Any more discussion? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay, 6-2. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to personally.
Okay, next up, we, 24 P18, Agency of Education Rules Governing Licensing of Educators and the Preparation of Education Professionals. We have three folks on here. We have Andrew Proughton, Assistant Director, Educator of Quality Division Agent, AOE, Katie Gagliardo, and Ronald Ryan. So I believe all of you are on Zoom. Who's going to be speaking or?
Yes, can you hear me okay? My name is Ron Ryan, and I'm actually speaking on behalf of Andrew Prouden today because Andrew can't be at the meeting. So it'll be myself and Katie Gagliardo, if there are any particular questions. So what we are presenting to you today is a summary of the Vermont Standards Board for Professional Educator rules. And we're here on behalf of that committee as well as the Agency of Education. Every year there are some tweaks and some deletions and some additions to our licensing rules for educators. And we're here with this year's changes. So what I'd like to do is just kind of give you a brief summary of them. There's around 12 of them, I believe, in your summary sheet. And the first one has to do with driver's education in vehicle only. And this is for the school districts that are seeking driver's ed teachers. If they only want a driver's ed teacher as far as a vehicle driver, then the new rule allows that person not to have a bachelor's degree. And that coincides with the Department of Motor Vehicles because they also don't require a bachelor's degree. So we wanted to be in sync with DMV on that. Another rule that we're looking at is language to better match terminology around testing outside of Vermont, meaning we're trying to make some other options for educators. So rather than just accepting Vermont tests, some other states provide tests that are very much similar to Vermont. And we want to be able to use those tests if they are appropriate. And so that particular language really allows us to use all 50 states and any other US state, which is excluded currently. Another piece is expanding testing waiver for Praxis 2. Currently, educators have to take a Praxis core test, which is a basic skills test for math and literacy. And then they also have to take a Praxis 2 content test. And in the past, they've had to, before any other options would come up for an educator, they had to fail that Praxis 2 test 3 times before there were other opportunities. And now that has been changed to one time. So if they do fail the Praxis 2 test once, then they can look at some other options in terms of different multiple measures that they could use in lieu of that test. the provisional license for school psychologists, we're looking at ways to allow them to come into the state of Vermont. There are a few psychologists coming in, and we want to be able to make sure that the national rules and guidelines correspond to what Vermont has. So there's been some pieces put in place now to allow a school psychologist to come into the state, get on a provisional, and be able to teach for 2 years and continue their program. There's a rule about special ed that we're actually deleting. And that particular rule, right now, an educator can be on a temporary provisional license for 2 years. And if at the end of that 2-year period, they have not met all the requirements to get their initial license, they are allowed to seek an extension. And all endorsements were allowed to do that except for special ed. And special ed had to go through a waiver process to do that. So based on new updated information, we wanted to make sure that special ed was in sync with the rest of the endorsements. So by deleting that particular rule, they will be allowed to have that 3rd year like all other endorsements. We have a model code of ethics that we use for all educators throughout the state. And this is a national model code of ethics. We use it for all of our educators in terms of the process, their standards, knowing what an educator is responsible for. This gets updated periodically, and they just updated another version of this. So we wanted to make sure we adopted the most updated version of the model code of ethics. And a school psychologist, again, want to make sure that they, again, have their National Association of School Psychologists guidelines adopted and detailed in the Vermont side. So we are in sync with what the National Association is seeking for school psychologists. Early childhood education, we've updated some language on that just to, again, be in sync with the National Association for Educators of Young Children. So those standards have been updated to coincide with their recent language. We have a new mathematics specialist endorsement. That is an endorsement that had been sought by quite a few of the school districts throughout the state. Currently, we have a specialized literacy professional. And as you know, within school districts, literacy and math seem to be high priorities. And we did not have a math specialist endorsement in the past. And we wanted to work with the districts, and we created a new math specialist endorsement. So it would allow a school district, for example, to hire somebody to be a math specialist, which they could do within a district pre-K to 12. And if they did, they would use this particular endorsement to seek that. School counselor, again, we've updated language to coincide with the national standards. And school psychologist, again, as I'm saying, it's language around the national standards. And then special ed, again, this is more updating of the new special ed language through the Council of Exceptional Children. So those are basically the updates that we have, or deletions, and I'm happy to try to answer any of your questions.
Ready?
I have a question about alternate routes to licensure. And there's an indication that there are alternate routes. Can you talk a little bit about the specific ways that someone would achieve licensure? Are the alternate routes specified for individual areas?
Yeah, we currently have those already in our regulations. So again, it depends on what an individual has. They may have a license already from another state. If they do, they can come into Vermont through what we call reciprocity and get a license here. Again, it depends on their degree, their background. They could either go through a traditional program here in Vermont. They may have already had a license, and so they're adding an endorsement. They could do that. Or we have what some of you have heard before, an alternative route, which is peer review. And that allows an educator who may not have all of the transcript and background, but they have a lot of professional learning experiences, work experiences, and they could go that alternative route to licensure. So all of those are actually spelled out in our rule book.
In your rule book or your procedures?
In the rules.
And then do you have specific individuals or groups who monitor the experiential learning or other information?
Can you clarify what you mean by monitoring?
Evaluate.
We wouldn't evaluate. They have to go through an application process with the agency, so it's all done through an application process, which we review all of their documentation and information to determine which licensure path they would head to. So they would submit credentials to us, resume, anything that they've done, and then they would choose the correct application path.
So who reviews all that information?
The Agency of Ed, particular licensing specialist that might have that application. It really depends on what they're doing. We have a renewal season. That's educators that already have a license in Vermont and they're renewing it. We average about 4,000 to 5,000 of those a year. And they would be done again by our licensing specialists within the Agency of Ed. And there are a number of things that they would have to go through. I mean, they have to be fingerprinted. They have to go through criminal record checks. So there's a whole process and steps that they actually go through before they attain a license.
Any other comments, questions? Dr. McDonald.
Mr. Chair, this committee approved independent school standards a couple weeks back, which, according to the testimony, were separate from those that public school personnel had to do and not quite equal. Does the current rules before us permit principals in schools to declare teachers qualified, certified to teach based on their previous experiences other than getting degrees or being certified by the state through other means?
Can you expand on what your question is again? I'm sorry.
It has been traditional in recent years for vocational classes, for example,
Okay.
searching for welding teachers to take applications from people who have welded for 30 years
Yeah.
and wish to teach. And they are granted or recommended to be certified by the principals of the vocational school for being qualified welders.
Yes. Thank you for expanding on that.
Do the rules here allow similar local officials to declare people, recommend people to be eligible for teaching English, for example, if they've, trying to think of it, if they've written newspaper articles for the local paper when they were prior to their application.
Yeah, I mean, there are options for an educator within the school district. You know, if they want to hire a particular person, but it depends on the credentials that they have. But if they have, let's just use a scenario, a school district can't find an English teacher, but they have somebody that has a bachelor's degree in social studies that really wants to help them out. And they've advertised, they can't get anybody. That's the only application that they have. They could hire that person as an English teacher for 1 year under what we call an emergency license. It's a 1 year license. It's a temporary license, allows them to work for a year. And then during that year, they would either have to take the appropriate coursework or praxis test to then qualify for a further license the following year. And as far as your CTE, we can talk about that for a minute because you use an example of welding. There are also application processes for those CTE centers to submit applications for a welder, for example. If they need a welder in their CTE center, they can submit what we call an apprenticeship program. So it's actually a 4-year program for an applicant, so they can serve in a CTE center under that particular area of expertise.
So if I were to ask you if a welder can be certified to teach English, you're going to tell me no.
That's right, unless they have an English
So
background.
I'm trying to understand where the line is between teaching, having a welder be certified and a social studies teacher be certified to teach English.
Yeah, in order for a social studies teacher to be certified to teach English long-term, I said short-term, they could do it if they had a bachelor's degree for 1 year. If they want to do it further than that, they would have to pass the Praxis 2 content test in English, or they would have to take a degree and get a degree in English to do that.
So you get a 1 year
Temporary,
pass,
yes,
and then if you can pass a content test,
yes,
you're good.
yes. You
But
would
a
be,
welder, get a job for a year welding and then pass a contest test for English and be good.
if a welder wanted to go down that route, yes. I mean, and somebody on an apprenticeship for welding for 4 years, they actually go through a program through VTC. It's a 24 credit program. Once they finish that program, then they're licensed as a CTE teacher. Once they have that initial license as a CTE teacher, then they can add other endorsements, just like other educators.
So I'll repeat my question again. If someone is certified to teach welding because they used to be a welder
Yeah.
for 1 year, at the end of that year, can they take a test to see whether they have the skills to teach English and then be certified to teach English?
They can do that, but the only way that would happen is if the district or the superintendent of that CT center wanted them to be an English teacher, they would have to be the individual to submit an application on their behalf to do that.
So it was my impression when I was reading the rules for independent schools that independent schools were permitted to do what I just suggested. If
Yeah.
the director of the independent school wanted a welder to teach English
Yeah.
after a year, that was okay.
Yes, I mean, again, I don't know all of the independent rules, but they are more flexible around that. Yes, and they don't have to have licenses in those particular areas.
And Mr. Chair, but independent schools get the same tax money that public schools, and let it go at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? On the break.
Not hearing none, I would move approval of Rule 24.8, Agency of Education, rules governing the licensing of educators and the preparation of education professionals.
We have a motion from Senator Bray to approve the rule. I just have a quick question, Committee Assistant. Did we receive any letters from ministers? Any additional questions, comments? Senator Lyons?
Short comment or question, and that is, as you were talking earlier, you indicated that you have thousands of these evaluations for alternate routes. And my question is, is there sufficient staff to cover the needs for that type of evaluation?
I appreciate that question coming up. I think that's difficult. I would say that there are certain times of the year where we need additional staff. And if those needs come up, I would just say from my standpoint, I would make those requests to my supervisor. So I would just say that, yes, the need does arise where we need additional staff. And if that's the case, we will make that recommendation. Whether it occurs, that's another budgetary issue, but we do make that request.
That's why I asked the question, but thank you very much.
Any other questions, comments?
Comment, Mr. Chair?
Senator McDonald?
I'm having trouble getting a welder. Thank you.
Call the question. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Okay,
Thank you very much.
thanks. Okay, next up, we have 23P44, Department of Disabilities, Aging and Independent Living Residential Care Home and Assisted Living Licensing Regulations. Speaking for the department, General Counsel, and we have Helen Levon, Secretary of Vermont Healthcare Association, Haley Cooper, State Long-Term Care Ombudsman, Vermont Legal Aid, and Leah Burdick, Staff Attorney, Elder Law Projects. And we'll start with Stuart Shu.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me just introduce myself for the record. I'm Stuart Scher, General Counsel with the Department of Disabilities, Aging and Independent Living, also known as DALE. And also on screen today, we have Pam Coda, who is the Division of Licensing and Protections Licensing Chief. And also sitting next to me is Carol Scott, who is the State Long-Term Care Manager, also with DALE's Division of Licensing and Protection. Both Ms. Coda and Ms. Scott are available to answer any questions that may arise. So let me just give an overview of what this rule is intended to do. So the DALE and the Agency of Human Services seek to amend the residential care home licensing regulations and the assisted living residence licensing regulations, which were last adopted in 2000 and 2003, respectively, and to consolidate them into a single regulatory set. They will be referred to as the Residential Care Home and Assisted Living Residence Licensing Rules. Now, the current Res Care Home and ALR rules were developed for residents who needed lower levels of assistance, who were simply unable to live independently. For example, folks needing help with medications, meals, some of the activities of daily living. But since the adoption of these rules, Vermonters and people in general have tended to stay in their homes longer, and upon entering residential care or assisted living, have higher needs. Ownership of these homes has also shifted from local to at times large corporations that operate in many states with complex business and ownership structures. In addition to a general shift in the use of group care settings, the choices for care and enhanced residential care programs have placed hundreds of nursing home level of care residents into these homes. Roughly half of our residential care homes and assisted living residences are enhanced residential care or nursing home level of care providers. The current regulations, however, do not provide the protections needed for a population that has increased and complex care needs, or the guidance to the managers of these homes and how to provide safe care to residents who need nursing home level of care. So to address these needs, which became even more apparent during the COVID pandemic, the department, and more specifically the licensing agency, guided by the professional scope of practice, identified the importance of clearly defining minimum standards, all of which are necessary to protect residents' rights and safety and to ensure the quality of care provided. More specifically, in addition to housekeeping modifications and updates to reflect current standards, proposed changes include, but are not limited to, the following. The rule adds requirements for residential care homes and assisted living residences that care for nursing home level of care residents to ensure adequate protections and adequate care and services for residents to ensure they're able to attain or maintain their highest practical level of well-being. The rule expands the ability to use licensed practitioners other than physicians, since many primary care practitioners are physician's assistants or nurse practitioners. It adds enforcement tools of appointment of a temporary manager and requiring directed plans of correction. It adds a requirement for uniform disclosure agreements so residents know upon admission what the home can, cannot, will, and will not provide. It also adds a requirement to inform residents of the bed hold policy. It adds a requirement for pre-admission evaluation process. It clarifies the role of nurses. It adds clarity concerning medicated administration and management. Enhanced training and background check requirements are added, and it clarifies existing and inserts new nursing home level of care requirements. So after the proposed rule, after it was filed, the state received dozens of public comments. The state responded to every one of them and in many cases modified the proposed rule to reflect those recommendations. The department appreciates the thoughtful input offered by providers, advocates, and resident representatives. Now, the department is sensitive to the fact that operators of these homes may be dissatisfied with any provision that imposes an increased burden on them, while advocates, on the other hand, may conclude that the proposed rule is not sufficiently robust. In an effort to strike an appropriate balance between those interests, the department only added those standards deemed necessary to directly improve resident safety or care or licensing oversight. The department notes that many of the changes identified by the operators as imposing a new economic burden merely codify existing expectations and provide guidance based upon professional scope of practice. This is an important point that I want to be clear about. A residential care home licensee is not required to provide nursing home level of care to its residents. When a residential care home chooses to do so, however, along with the increased payments for serving those residents comes a heightened obligation to ensure those residents' nursing home level of care needs are met and their safety is protected. These rules offer needed clarification regarding acceptable responsibilities for nurses based on their licensure, scope of practice for registered nurses, licensed practical nurses, licensed nursing assistants, and unlicensed caregivers differ per Vermont statutes, and these rules clearly outline regulatory requirements for nursing tasks and nursing delegation per accepted scope of practice. If homes have been operating with minimal staff or minimal professional nursing, there may be additional costs associated with adjusting practices to ensure the quality of care and nursing care is aligned with professional standards and nursing scope of practice. Further, when providing ERC, enhanced residential care, or nursing home level of care, residential care homes have always been responsible for adhering to the ERC requirements, so there should be no economic impact on those already doing so. If providers believe the minimum standards articulated in these rules to be unreasonable, the department, notwithstanding its written responses to the comments received, welcomes the opportunity to respond to each of those concerns today. Finally, AHS and Dale were guided by the rulemaking requirements set forth in statute, and having reviewed the authority of this committee as set forth in 3 VSA Section 842, the department asserts the statutory requirements for approval of the rule have been satisfied. Number one, the rule is not beyond the authority of the agency. The rule is necessary to comply with the requirements in 33 VSA 7117A, which grants the Secretary of Human Services the authority to, quote, adopt reasonable rules to carry out the provisions of this chapter and prescribe minimum standards of care, program administration, and sanitation for facilities licensed under Title 33, Chapter 71. Second, the rule is not contrary to the intent of the legislature. The proposed rule adheres to the requirements of the statute that I just referenced. Agency staff have taken steps to ensure that the provisions of the rule are consistent with state and federal statutory and regulatory requirements. Evidencing the legislature's intent to ensure that the necessary care and services are provided to residents of nursing homes, 33 VSA 7117B also speaks to the requirements that the Secretary of Human Services adopt, quote, comprehensive rules for licensing of nursing homes, where nursing home level of care, by definition, is provided that, one, require facilities to provide the care and services necessary to help each resident attain or maintain the highest practicable physical, mental, and psychosocial well-being in accordance with a comprehensive assessment and plan of care and prevailing standards of care as determined by the Commissioner of Dale. And two, promote a standard of care that ensures that the ability of each resident to perform activities of daily living does not diminish unless the resident's ability is diminished solely as a result of a change in the resident's clinical condition, end quote. Residents in residential care homes who are receiving nursing home level of care at the election of the residential care home deserve to be protected by rules that are as comprehensive as those that govern Vermont's nursing homes. The rule is not arbitrary. The rules articulate the agency's expectation of providers in meeting the needs of their residents, and they offer guidance to the operators of those facilities that aligns with the professional scope of practice. As you have seen from the department's submission, the licensing agency has taken great steps to include all stakeholders in this process and to listen and respond to their input. As defined in 3 VSA 801B13, the proposed language would make sense to a reasonable person, and the decisions are rationally connected to the asserted factual bases. As such, the rule is not arbitrary. And I'm almost done. Number 4, the economic impact analysis does not fail to recognize any substantial economic impact. As noted above, there may be some cost to operators, but primarily to those who choose to provide nursing home level of care in their residential care facilities and who are not adhering to the current enhanced residential care requirements or are not following scope of practice. While there may be cost to some operators, the cost of not incorporating these minimum standards in recognition of and in response to the increased needs of residents living in these homes is even greater. In the interest of time, the department points to its response as set forth in its June 2025 memo to the committee regarding its efforts to maximize the opportunities of public input. So based on all of that, AHS and Dale respectfully request that the committee approve the final proposed rule as updated and submitted to the committee on July 22nd without objection. Thank you.
Thank you, committee. Representative Hagelin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the in-depth report. I certainly have a lot of questions, a lot of concerns. A lot of the comments from the public talked about some of these concerns. I'll just talk about one here, talking about, and I apologize for not knowing which group. It got pretty confusing to understand which group made the comments. But again, one particular one talking about, we believe that certain changes outlined in the proposal are not necessary, are not feasible, and will cause economic hardship. And then again, they go into talking about 80% of the residents that they serve are on Medicaid. Again, the answer to that was the issues raised regarding Medicaid reimbursement rates is outside the purview of these regulations. And I guess I'd like to say that that's our job in the sense of understanding that. And, some of the concerns here as well said, okay, if you're going to impose these new regulations and Medicaid's not going to cover any of it again, is a state willing to step up and make additional payments. Again, my concern is, I mean, we've lost Derby Green, Scenic View. What's more important? Is it more important to have stricter regulations when we're losing facilities left and right? Again, that's part of my concern. And I don't know if you can address that to some degree, but again, I don't think the answer that you gave for some of these concerns were really enough.
Well, thank you for the question. And it is something that we took very seriously, obviously, in making sure as we amended this rule to not overburden the facilities themselves. So it was a balance that we tried to strike. We believe we struck the appropriate balance in making sure that the health and safety and the rights of residents were protected while making sure that we didn't overburden facilities, because we know how important they are in serving these residents, and we certainly have to have them in the state of Vermont. But I also want to point out that a lot of the expressed concerns about economic burden and overburdening the facilities just frankly didn't ring true in many respects. We believe that a lot of the requirements that are now reduced to writing, that have now been codified in these rules, have been existing practice for many, many years. What I think would be helpful, and as I suggested in my testimony, would be to hear precisely from, and I think it's from the Healthcare Association, precisely what provisions they believe are onerous or overly burdensome to them, because we have failed to see how the imposition or the inclusion of certain training requirements, for example, or requirements for certain skill levels is beyond what facilities should be doing, especially for those who choose to provide housing to individuals who meet nursing home level of care. So I think it would be important to hear from the Healthcare Association specifically as to what they believe are overly burdensome, and then we can respond to those. And Pam, perhaps you have some specific comments, or maybe you just want to wait for to hear from the Healthcare Association, and we can respond that way.
I think it would be the most efficient to respond to the specific comments. So if we could hear those, that would be great.
Wonderful.
Representative.
Just a quick follow-up, and again, maybe this isn't that big a deal, but there's a lot of concern for some reason around the term shall. I mean, we here in the legislature use may and shall, and now you want to use must. I mean, I don't really appreciate having a bunch of different categories of what somebody shall do or must do or whatever. I mean, I certainly like to at least keep it consistent that in the legislature, we have shall and may, and people understand that, or at least we do here in the building. So I don't know why that's such a big deal.
Well, as you know, these rules that have been around since the early 2000s did use the word shall. There are conventions, drafting conventions that the Agency of Human Services uses in the healthcare administrative rule setting, where the use of the word shall has been replaced as rules are being amended with a must or a may or a will as appropriate. So that is the reason for that. I think you're absolutely right. The use of the word shall has served all of us well for many, many years. But in order to just align with the Agency of Human Services rules, we have changed those and have been asked to change those.
Thank you.
Sure.
Alliance, did you?
You bet. I do have some questions, and I will probably ask some of them after we've heard from other folks. But I'm looking at the Vermont Legal Aid comment, and for 5.3A1 little I. And so suppose someone does have an acute medical need and there's a voluntary discharge. So right now, our nursing homes are backed up anyway. There's no place to put people. And if someone is in a respite care facility, what is the process here for ensuring that the patient or the individual is taken care of?
Pam, do you understand that question and you want to?
I guess I'm looking for some clarity on that question. So is the question about the healthcare system and whether folks?
No, the question is about a res care facility that has an individual who goes into acute medical needs and there's an interest in having an involuntary discharge. What is the procedure for that to guarantee that the individual is placed appropriately and that we don't get into this long waiting list process that we currently have? So we don't have a lot of nursing home beds available when someone has an acute medical need. Sometimes they're left in hospitals. And if it happens when someone's in a res care facility, what's next step? How do we ensure that the patient is cared for?
So what we typically expect when that situation occurs, when a residential care home has identified that someone exceeds their level of care, therefore issues an involuntary discharge notice, is that they meet those needs in the interim. So if they've identified someone has a new need in terms of their transferability, that they know they can't meet on an ongoing basis, they have to meet that need until they find a safe and appropriate discharge location. So it's really about in the meantime, and if that does extend, that the residential care home does need to locate the ability or train their staff to be able to meet that need until the person can be placed at a higher level of care.
And so what role, if any, does the family play in that decision-making so that the individual who lives in Newport isn't placed in Brattleboro?
I mean, depending on whether the resident is their own decision maker, it would be up to the facility working with the decision maker. So whether that's the resident or that's a family or that's a legal guardian, in terms of the best appropriate placement. Sometimes that placement is not the person's first choice. There are significant wait lists at some of the better nursing homes in Vermont. So sometimes that does have to work their way down the list. But safe and appropriate is the name of the game here in terms of when it comes to discharge planning, is finding a location that can meet those level of care needs. Sometimes it might not be in the same community, but residential care homes are only licensed to provide level 3 care and not nursing home level of care. So they do need to have the ability to discharge folks when they exceed their licensed level of care if they're not a residential care home that chooses to take care of nursing home level of care residents.
And consideration is given for whether or not the patient is a Medicaid patient. So if it's a Medicaid patient, there are certain nursing homes that probably are not going to accept that patient.
I'm not sure how it differs by payment source. We only have 2 nursing homes in Vermont that don't accept Medicaid, actually 3 that don't accept Medicaid. So the majority do. So I'm just, the majority of our nursing homes and our nursing home beds are Medicaid available beds.
Okay, I have another question, and it's related to 5.9.d as it came over in the July 22nd changes. It's in your the summary list of changes. And so my question is, and it's a question that I had earlier about the other set of rules before this was changed by eliminating, I think you eliminated a sentence. Yep, you deleted the first sentence. The Board of Nursing has very specific rules about delegation for RNs to LPNs and others. So I'm wondering why you don't simply indicate Board of Nursing rules by reference rather than inserting this language. And the reason I ask that is, the Board of Nursing rules may change. And so when those rules change, it would seem appropriate that that Dale would follow the rules in this case.
So what we found and what we have found for many, many years is that there's a lack of awareness of the limitations and the direction from the Board of Nursing on professional nurses. So we tried to clarify. So a lot of the wording in these regulations is clarification of the registered nurse's role as compared to the unlicensed staff or a licensed nurse. So we found that there wasn't the knowledge base in the nurses that were providing the nursing oversight in terms of what is actually required for delegation and what's in line with professional scope of practice. So a lot of the nursing rules here are for clarification because of what we found of a lack of understanding of what it really meant to be a registered nurse overseeing the care in residential care homes.
So why wouldn't you just provide that information as a reference to the Board of Nursing rules and have those rules as a link for nurses working at a care facility?
Senator, we certainly could include a link for greater clarity. But I also want to point the committee to the definitions in section 2.2 of the rule. The definition of delegation of nursing tasks does in fact reference the formal process approved by the Vermont Board of Nursing. So there is a reference in the rule to the process approved by the board, which permits professional nurses to assign nursing tasks to other individuals as long as the RN or licensed practical nurse, under direction and oversight of the home's registered nurse, provides proper training, oversight, and monitoring, and for which the registered nurse retains responsibility. So
Yes, that's true. 5.9.d is very specific. And so if there's any modification to the Board of Nursing rules that would not track into this set of rules. Just thought.
Right. I think that the intent here was not to incorporate all of the nursing home rules by reference, but to provide the clarity as to what those expectations are for purposes of guidance. If it's the committee's direction or guidance to include that, we can certainly do so. Do you see any concerns with that, Pam?
Well, I'd like to just speak because we're speaking about 5.9D. As a registered nurse, I can, speak to the fact that delegation will not ever extend past someone's employment. There's a large misunderstanding out there in this world of delegating medication administration to unlicensed staff, which is the majority of these homes choose to have unlicensed staff give medications to residents. But this 5.9D is specifically trying to fill a gap where if a registered nurse leaves, there's no legal authority for those unlicensed staff to be giving medications to residents who cannot manage their own medications. So we needed to add some clarification that makes it very clear that when a registered nurse is no longer employed, the unlicensed staff do not have a license to operate under. So it's a pretty big safety risk in the world of delegation, which is how these homes are run, that there will not be a case where the Board of Nursing rules change to allow for delegation to extend when that nurse is no longer authorizing those folks to practice under his or her license.
Okay, I'll hold my questions and comments until after we've heard from others.
Just a quick question. What's the adoption date for this rule?
The effective date or the adoption date?
Adoption date.
We
I see September 3rd on here. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, that's the deadline for adoption. Yes, will be September 3rd currently,
Right.
unless it's further extended. But we anticipate that being done. We're hoping that can be done so that we have an effective date for the rule of January 1st of next year.
All right, thanks. Representative Hidley?
I do have another quick question. It looks like I've highlighted here, so When it becomes apparent that a resident is no longer capable of managing funds and or property, licensee shall contact the resident's legal representative, if any, or the next of kin. And the next of kin has been removed. I'm just wondering why that is. What was the problem there? I would think that would be a good option.
The individual's next of kin, necessarily, it may not be, the individual's choice. The legal representative has the standing, and the authority to be notified and to make any decisions that need to be made. So we felt that that was an appropriate response.
But it basically says the resident's legal representative, if any. So if there isn't, then they could go to the next of kin.
I'm trying to pull up our response.
It's 11.5, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
To discuss it.
Sorry about that.
No, it's
Scroll
fine.
through. 11.5, okay.
You know, one of the
Then it goes on to say that if
Yeah.
there is no legal representative, then it
Sure.
used to say, or next of kin, the licensee must meet with the resident to discuss the resident's ability to manage funds and or property. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me, but.
So from what I recall, you know, the discussion around this involved the autonomy and the dignity and privacy of the resident. And concerns were raised or conversations were took place regarding the residents next of kin not necessarily having the right to know about changes in a person's cognition or concerns about them managing finances. And again, it's based on individuality and autonomy of residents living in these homes, which, there were certainly some comments to protect that individuality and autonomy.
So who makes that decision, whether somebody's not cognitive, doesn't have the cognitive reasoning abilities to make those decisions? Is that, who makes that decision?
Well, ultimately, there'd be a medical provider involved if someone was no longer able to make medical decisions. But in this case, you know, it's really informing someone of their rights and their choices, and getting assistance with, okay, what are the next steps? Instead of mandating guardianship or mandating their family get involved when they might not want their family to be involved or know about a change in their medical condition. So it's really about explaining to the resident what their choices are and what their rights are. And typically the managers of the home, the folks who are responsible for assisting them to manage their funds, if the facility is holding, would have an idea that there's some issue, and then have that conversation with the resident, legal guardian if there is one, but then be able to discuss options with the resident and assist them to be able to make a choice about what the next step is.
Okay, thank you.
Send bond
Just to follow up on this, I think that if you don't have somebody appointed and the person is not able to engage in that discussion, my guess is, am I right that the home would seek a legal guardian?
A long-term ombudsman.
Or an ombudsman? There would be somebody who would, in either ombudsman or appointed legal guardian to take over that responsibility. And the facility might have to go to the probate court and ask for that. But my guess is that would happen if the person is not able to understand what you're trying to communicate to them and there is nobody. Am I right that would happen?
That is certainly an option. Any interested person, which could in fact be the facility itself, could petition the probate court for the appointment of a guardian. If in fact that person lacks the capacity to make decisions and there is no one else to make those decisions identified, and there's no private guardian who is willing to step up, the Office of Public Guardian could actually be appointed to fill that role. So yeah, I think to to Ms. Coda's point, this is all about recognizing the dignity and the choice of individuals and not simply assuming that the resident's next of kin is someone that resident would want to have information shared with. I'm sure we can all think about situations in our own lives where just because someone is the closest relative to you does not mean that you, by blood, does not mean that you wish to share that information with them. So that was the justification for removing the next of kin, but there are avenues for addressing the needs of the resident who lacks capacity. And I think one of those examples is, you're absolutely right, is petitioning the probate court for guardianship.
I
don't want to beat this horse, but does the, and by the way, I agree with you about the next of kin. I think that's, I like where, that's a good move on my, I think. But the question is, would the facility have an obligation under that circumstance to seek the guardian?
There's nothing in the rule that imposes an obligation. Any interested person or interested party can do that, but it would not be an obligation.
Thank you.
Well, I was going to ask, do you think that should be set out what in the rule, what next steps would be? Or is this so well understood? I mean, not everybody knows all these things. So I wonder, I mean, are you comfortable, Representative Baumgartz, with just, well, if they think of it? I'm not, but
there is also the option, I would point out, to contacting legal aid, to contacting the area agencies on aging, contacting, there are a number, the long-term care ombudsman's office, which also sits within Vermont Legal Aid, for resources. And so that information is scattered throughout these rules as a resource available to these facilities. So mandating that they perform a particular task, we didn't necessarily believe that was appropriate in light of, as I mentioned before, trying to balance the interests of individuals with not being overly onerous to these facilities, adding an additional obligation that they perform a certain task when they're claiming currently that they are in many respects short-staffed, that there would be an economic burden on them is one additional measure that we didn't feel that was necessary in light of the other resources available to them.
could we provide information in the rule without obligating them? They just did. They just did. You think they did? It's in the rules. Okay.
But there's no requirement that the facility notify the long-term care ombudsman when the individual has no representative other than the facility. There's no requirement that the facility let the long-term care ombudsman know that this person is sort of alone.
I don't believe the rules require that contact.
And there's no statutory requirement that happen.
Not that I'm aware of. Perhaps Ms. Kuiper could point that out if it exists, but I'm not aware of there being an obligation.
I'm not aware either. Thank you.
Okay, in the getting concerned about time. And we have additional witnesses regarding this rule, so I'd like to move to that. That's okay with the committee. All right, and I think next up would be Helen. Is it Levon?
Sorry, my
Helen, you there?
coming off. There we go. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. And the last name again?
Laban. Sorry to throw you a curveball there.
All right, you're on. You're providing testimony. We don't have a copy of your testimony. I don't see it on our website either, so.
No, because I did not submit written testimony, but I'm happy to follow up with items in writing, especially if there are any questions that come up that require follow-up. I'm happy to provide that. So for the record, I'm Helen Laban, Executive Director of the Vermont Healthcare Association. We represent skilled nursing facilities, assisted living residences, and residential care homes, the second two of which are the focus here. And we're wanted to raise two concerns about implementation of these rules, both of which have been flagged in the preceding conversation. And the first is around that lack of an economic impact assessment. As we've noted, these licensing rules are 25 years out of date. Certainly no one disputes the fact that they need to be updated. And also with that amount of time elapsed, we can intuit that there's going to be an economic impact from business as usual. I do want to clarify that when we talk about identifying economic impacts, that just because you identify an economic impact doesn't mean you don't do it. We look at this as when you identify economic impact, that means you take a second look, maybe you do a cost benefit analysis and you decide not to make some of these changes. But for many of the others, we would anticipate there'd be an opportunity to shape how they get implemented. And so when VHCA looked at these rules and worked with our members who were very good, starting last May when the first drafts were shared, doing a detailed analysis to that question of economic impact, what we did after reviewing the contents standing alone is we took the list of items in the proposed regulations that our members felt would be a change from business as usual and operations as they currently stand. From that, we asked the question, all right, well, of this list, what of these items have a potential significant impact on finances and operations? And so that narrows it down, right? And then from there, what do members anticipate they will do to mitigate those impacts or to manage those impacts? And we did have 31 members who were well engaged in that very detailed technical review. And from that, we felt that, yes, there would almost certainly be an economic impact, and perhaps just as importantly, that it isn't always obvious, right? That if doing a more detailed review would give new information that would help with implementation of the rules. And when we say helping with implementation, I'm basically looking at three things here besides that cost benefit on whether something should happen or not. One is around timeline and support needed to make the changes feasible. Another would be to communicate with DEVA, who sets the Medicaid rates, what the regulators anticipate seeing in operations so that they can do the needed analysis to determine how that is or is not reflected in those Medicaid rates. I should say that there was a detailed analysis in 2023, so we already have a baseline of how far below current costs of services some of these Medicaid rates are. So we do have, luckily, that starting point available to us. And then the last area would be to track the risk for loss of access to care, particularly for residents who have Medicaid as an initial or primary payer. We do, from our perspective, see that there is a real risk there. And there are some nuances in how you would track that. We also worked on that. And our recommendation would be that this does need a detailed economic impact assessment and some plans for how we're going to manage implementation based on that. So that's the first body of concerns. And then the second is in that incorporation of the nursing rules. So any change in nursing rules is going to concern our providers because there's a workforce shortage right now. It was a problem, got much worse during the pandemic, and we haven't come out of that cycle yet. And so some of this is going to be in the economic impact assessment. So it does relate to that component of it. But then separately, we are concerned about how that scope of practice is written into these facility licensing rules. And so I am not a lawyer. Apologies to lawyers in the room, but the way I, as a layperson, think about this is that when you're doing facility licensing regulations, you're going to talk about the services that need to be available at different levels of care, and you're going to talk about how surveyors determine that those services are being provided and that the care plan is being appropriately implemented in general. But as soon as you start assigning specific activities to different licensure of nurse, and registered nurse is a licensure level, it's not a generic term. To me, that's when you start listing out scope of practice. And as we've discussed in the previous conversation, that's under the authority of the Board of Nursing. So these rules are setting up now two authorities for who determines scope of practice for a nurse when they are working within a long-term care facility. And that disconnect is a problem kind of however you think about what this interpretation does to the rules. So if it is simply clarifying what's currently in the Board of Nursing rules, that isn't necessarily okay. There's the question of how do we keep pace if it's changing, but also the question of if the reinterpretation isn't clear on the ground, who has the ultimate authority to offer that interpretation and guidance? And we would always say that if it has to do with the professional practice of nursing and what a nurse can do within that scope of practice, is the Board of Nursing, that no gray area Board of Nursing. And this now introduces a big gray area there.
Helen, can you wrap up, please?
Yep, that was in fact basically the end of it. Is that we've now introduced a gray area that we don't know how to respond to. We would also say that it reduces the scope of practice for example, LPNs, which have been the backbone of the workforce. But even without that assumption, we think that this is unimplementable with those scope of professional practice rules integrated into the licensing rules for the facilities. So those are our two concerns. And happy to follow up with any more information or answer any questions if needed.
Okay, without objection, what I'd like to do is hear from the other two witnesses and then ask questions. Otherwise, I think we're going to go way beyond our time, just knowing this committee and how we do business. So next up will be Callie with the Vermont Legal Aid, the Long-Term Care Ombudsman.
Hello, my name is, sorry. Hello, my name is Kylie Kuiper, and I'm the Long-Term Care Ombudsman at Vermont Legal Aid. My office represents individuals who are receiving long-term care in licensed facilities, which include residential care and assisted living facilities. We work for the welfare and rights of individuals in these facilities. We thank Dale for their hard work on this rule update. We think it's important, and we submitted several sets of comments, and they made a lot of changes in response to our comments, and we appreciate that. We have a number of outstanding issues that I have narrowed down to 5 that I think are the most important for resident rights and welfare. The first one is that the rules don't define the word admission, but they rely on the moment of admission for several points. We hear from residents who live in residential care facilities who are not receiving the rights that they deserve, and they're being told that they were never admitted into the facility, even if they've been there for several weeks. So it's important to clarify when admission occurs. The rules say that a home is officially responsible for the resident's care needs at admission. Admission of the resident or an assessment of the resident needs to be completed within 14 days of admission, and also that a resident needs to be given their uniform consumer disclosure agreement, their admissions agreement, and a copy of their rights at the time of admission. And we understand that Dale said that the rules define resident, and that should be sufficient, but when the rules refer to the resident's admission, it's not clear when admission occurs unless that's defined. So we are proposing that it be defined as occurring before the home provides any care to the resident, to ensure that the moment they start providing care, the person is considered to be admitted and all of the rights associated with it apply. Our second point is that 30 days is not enough warning for rate increases. Previous drafts of the rule said that individuals would get 90 days notice. We understand that the Healthcare Association responded that, perhaps it was individual homes responded that that was too onerous, especially when Medicaid doesn't give a lot of notice for their rate changes that are implemented on January 1st. So as a compromise, we are proposing that voluntary private rate increases be given a 90-day notice. If it's a Medicaid rate increase that are less within the home's control, and there's somewhat there's a protection against out-of-pocket increases with the way the Medicaid costs are applied, that could be a 30-day notice. I do want to note that, as been mentioned today, there is an extreme shortage of long-term care beds, and there's an extreme shortage of in-home care. And so it is just very difficult for people who can't afford rate increases to find other options, especially on short notice. Number 3 is a concern about the resident's discharge location. The rules say that the resident's wishes about a discharge location would be considered when practicable and appropriate. We think that a resident's wishes about their own discharge location should always be considered. It should always be practical and appropriate. And to couch it is going to lead to confusion, and it's going to risk these residents' rights in these situations. We ask that it just be a clear statement that the home always consider the wishes of the resident as to discharge location. That doesn't mean that they have to implement it, but they should always consider it. Then on the other hand, this concept was discussed a little bit earlier today, that the rules say that the family's wishes should also be considered when practical and appropriate. And the family as a category doesn't have a right to have a say in a discharge location. There's a lot of family members who don't have the best interest of the resident, or that the resident does not wish to be involved. And so we ask that that be changed to the resident's representatives. The rules define a representative as a legal representative or someone the resident wishes, and that is appropriate in this situation. Number 4, the draft rules allow for situations in which drugs can be used for the purpose of discipline or convenience and not to treat medical symptoms. The rules state that in an emergency, a chemical restraint can be used on residents. Chemical restraint is defined as any drug that is used for discipline or convenience and not required to treat medical symptoms. We approve of that definition of chemical restraint, but we think that having an exception to when that would be appropriate is confusing, and those two concepts are in conflict. And it threatens the welfare of residents, and we ask that that exception just be removed, and that it say that chemical restraints are never appropriate. And then finally, we have concerns about the way the enhanced residential care program was incorporated into the rules. As Attorney Schur described, one of the reasons for updating this rule is because of this program, because there's more residents who need nursing home level of care. But the only clear reference to the ERC program, which allows residents to receive nursing home care under Medicaid, is that the enhanced residential care is defined. It's not mentioned anywhere in the rules. The rules do say that the admissions agreement must describe what services will be provided under the Medicare waiver programs. But nowhere in the rules does it say that the home must provide the care described in the admissions agreement. We want to make sure that that Dale has the authority to enforce that the agreements are actuated within the home. And so we ask that the rules clearly state that the services described in the admissions agreement must be provided by the home. And then further in the nursing home standard of care section, we ask that it specifically state that enhanced residential care providers must provide the services that they agree to in their agreement with the state of Vermont and that are outlined in their admissions agreement with ERC residents. Those are my comments. Thank you for your time.
All right, thanks. Appreciate that. Next, we'll hear from Leah Burdick, who is staff attorney with the Elder Law Project, Vermont Legal Aid. Leah, I ask you that if you're having the same position as the ombudsman, that you note that, but don't need to give a big explanation about that so we can keep on schedule here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Leah Burdick, a staff attorney at the Elder Law Project at Vermont Legal Aid. I echo Kylie's comments, especially with the enhanced residential care. We note that there really needs to be inclusion and reference to the requirements that homes who choose to provide that care follow those regulations and rules. I do want to point out we did provide extensive comments to Lcar as well as to Dale, and we appreciate the opportunity to come today to highlight some of our concerns. This is a huge rule set with a lot of changes, and we really appreciate the work that Dale has done. We do have some particular concerns around emergency discharges, especially with the right for a resident to return if they are discharged or go simply to a facility to like a hospital for care. And then if, as Senator Lyons noted, what happens when they're in the facility and the hospital, and then the home decides, oh, well, we can't provide the care anymore. Well, that we refer to that as hospital dumping. And so we really would like Dale to clarify the enforcement mechanism for the resident being able to return home if they are in the process of a discharge. We also want to note that the criterion for an involuntary discharge for the resident presents a threat to resident self or welfare of other residents or staff. We recommend that that threat, we don't have an objection to the idea that someone can be discharged from a home due to presenting a threat, but we would ask that that language there be inserted actual and credible in front of that to prevent some kind of confusion about what it means to actually be a threat. Because staff of homes are using these rules, we hope, to guide their conduct, because residents are reviewing these rules to understand their rights and their obligations. We would want much further clarity when it comes to the level of actual threat for this type of discharge. We also would like to ask that that Dale really consider clarifying when lease protections are required, because there is some confusion here around what someone has, the rights that they have when they are in a home, and there might be an admissions agreement, but remember, these homes are not under the purview of the landlord-tenant law, but federal law requires that homes have the same amount of protection, lease protections, when these homes are not under the purview of the landlord-tenant law. So we would ask that facilities be required to really clarify, provide much further clarity when it comes to the actual protection for a potential discharge from the home when there really is nowhere else to go. As we've noted, the options for transferring around homes, finding safe discharge are extremely limited in the state right now. We really want to encourage Dale to provide clarity, much further robust protections for residents in these homes. I recognize time is short, so I will stop there.
Okay, thank you. I think the way I'd like to proceed here is give the department the opportunity to respond to what they've just heard. If you can keep it concise as possible, that would be wonderful. And then I'll open it up to committee members for any questions that you still have.
All right. I'll take a first stab at some things, but when we get into the more technical issues around nursing home standards of care or nursing scope of practice, I'll defer to Ms. Coda on those pieces. To Ms. Laban's point about the economic impact, the department did consider all of the concerns that were raised by the Healthcare Association. And as I noted in my comments, we didn't fail to recognize any substantial economic impact. If we acknowledge that there may be some, and again, these are most likely to be incurred by those who are not following current scope of practice or are not adhering to the current accepted requirements when you're serving people who meet nursing home level of care. These residents are not living in nursing homes. They're living in residential care and assisted living residences. When homes choose to do that, they must follow a heightened level of scrutiny to ensure the safety and protection of the residents. If facilities don't want that obligation, then perhaps they shouldn't be taking on that responsibility. But that being said, I did not hear any specific provisions from Ms. Laban as to what was deemed to be particularly onerous and causing an undue economic burden on the facilities. As we went through the comments, we saw things such as training individuals prior to their start or upon their start and each year thereafter. We didn't think that was unreasonable. When you're serving residents with high needs, that staff, upon being brought on to work with these individuals, be trained in certain areas. That periodic training does not seem to be particularly onerous to me. There's a recognition that, yes, staff may be hard to come by. We're all experiencing that across the healthcare field is just one of the many areas. But to be lax with those requirements does a grave injustice to the individuals who are being served by these facilities. So we try to strike that balance. Again, I didn't hear anything that was particularly onerous. And if the Healthcare Association has specific concerns about that economic impact, we would welcome that opportunity to address that. But again, I don't believe there was any substantial economic impact that was not addressed, and that is the basis for any objection by this committee. Pam, do you want to speak to any of the issues that were raised by the advocates?
Yeah, let me just speak briefly about the scope of practice. Again, we are trying to clarify. So one of the things that I want the committee to understand about these homes is that managers don't have to be nurses. The staff is largely unlicensed staff. So these are folks without a professional license providing very high level of care to residents at times, depending on their care needs. Sometimes without a nurse on site more than one day a week. So there is very little oversight in some of these homes by anyone with professional training as a nurse. So the reason that we mention registered nurse so much in these regulations is because there was so much confusion about what the scope of practice is. Licensed practical nurses cannot practice independently. They're not independent practitioners. They have to work under the license of a registered nurse. And as we point out in the comments, we fully acknowledge that LPNs are a very important part of the practice of registered nurses, very important parts of the care team. And just because we don't mention them by name does not mean that they are not to be included. Registered nurses can use LPNs as part of their team in terms of delegation and their professional practice in these settings. But when we talk about registered nurses in our regulations, we are trying to clarify, and that's because we found vast lack of understanding between the managers and the actual registered nurses themselves about what it actually means to be the nurse oversight. And the registered nurse is ultimately responsible, which is why it's worded that way, but can certainly use LPNs as part of their team. So there's no prohibition of LPNs, and we don't see it as setting using our authority or setting another scope of practice. We are trying to educate because of what we've seen and because of the lack of understanding out there about what it takes to provide the nursing oversight. But when we're talking about nursing home level of care residents being cared for 24/7 and a nurse being in maybe one day a week for a few hours, we really need to clarify this role to make sure people understand that these folks deserve nursing oversight to provide the safest care possible, that unlicensed staff aren't the only ones taking care of folks. So when we mention the registered nurse, it's to clarify that nurse's role, because there's a lack of understanding and a lack of presence and supervision of the unlicensed staff performance of the tasks.
Committee members? Representative.
Just quickly, again, what you just talked about, Ms. Gota, is of concern. They talked about the rules that are set up here are different than the Board of Nursing. And I guess, how do you square them? You know, I mean, I can certainly understand there's an issue.
Yeah, I would just I would like to know where there is a thought that it deviates from the Board of Nursing, and then I could respond to that specifically.
Because that is clearly not the intent. The intent is to provide the clarity, but it's to align perfectly with the scope of practice and the Board of Nursing rules. That is not anything that we are trying to usurp because again, that is the responsibility. The enforcement of that is the responsibility of the Board of Nursing. We are trying to educate facilities that in using nurses and LPNs and other other practitioners who are not registered nurses, that there's an understanding that there is a scope of practice that must be followed. And so that is really all I believe that our regulations are, that these rules are attempting to do. If there's an area in which we are attempting to provide additional clarity, it is just for that. It's not to modify in any way the nursing home, the nursing scope of practice rules.
Mr. Chair, I guess, would Ms. Laban like to respond to that? And you're the one who had that major concern.
So a quick response to this would be, we have sort of two different levels of disagreement on the economic impact assessment. We simply disagree with the state on that, and I'm happy to submit the potential economic impact reports that we have been sharing for information. This is our assessment, and reasonable people can disagree. We happen to believe we're correct on that one, so happy to share those details. On the nursing scope of practice element, we don't disagree that we need clarifications, that the current rules are outdated. All of that is true. Our point of disagreement here is that we do not believe that the facility licensing regulations are the place to offer that clarification or education, that belongs in education, in working with the Board of Nursing and in working with members, not hardwiring by copying or, just writing into the text of the regulations for the facilities. So
Thank you.
Other committee members? Okay. I have a motion.
Chair, I think from the discussion here that there's still some negotiation that needs to be addressed. I don't know if an extension is appropriate here or not, but I feel that it is. To maybe get these groups together again to work out some of the concerns that have been addressed. That's what I'm hearing, but it's one member.
Committee members?
I would agree with that. I think there's still some things that could be discussed. Not everyone was going to be happy again, but I do think overall, I do think that the rules do meet legislative intent, but there are significant areas where we're hearing from advocates that there may be some changes that could be made.
Yeah, you brought up the issue about the Board of Nursing and maybe some incorporation in there to To clarify.
Sounds like there's some little things that could be done, in terms of notification. There are some other things that could be done in terms of referencing Board of Nursing rules. I think those things are important. I don't know that we're going to get at the whole economic impact statement.
Okay, I'm hearing for more than one member, that we'd like to postpone action in this period. Just doing a quick look here at calendar. I see that the 45-day review on this is August 9th. Do we have a scheduled meeting scheduled for the 8th of August? I know we talked about this, but is it on our schedule?
I'd have to look and see the session.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman.
Sorry.
What's the alternative if this were to go to a vote, but it's not passed? How does that differ from actually just giving an extension off the top?
Well, an extension is an opportunity for us to reconcile some of these differences, right?
Right.
And if we go to a vote today and for whatever reason, we're not approving it, right? I mean, that's essentially what you're saying.
How does that reset the timeline?
It would mean that we're technically objecting, right? In which case, there's a process that kicks in, there's a 2-week opportunity for them to respond. So I would say, why do that if we can just postpone and do a more amicable process? Charlie?
I haven't got it pulled up. We can make a, whatever you want.
I understand that, but is the 8th one part of our schedule? Yes, it is. I just found it. Okay. So one of the things we could do is carry this over. I don't think we need any changes from the department, given it still fits within their 45-day review. I'm also now sensitive to the fact that we didn't get to the 4th rule, the housing rule, which I think does require some conversation. I was thinking about extending this meeting, but now I'm thinking that we'll need more than probably a half an hour on that topic. In deference to the folks that do have feedback on this rule. And Heidi, thanks for sticking with us for a couple hours.
And Nicole.
And I know Brenda's here and I know the folks also. So I'm going to put out to the committee that we come back on the 8th. We take up the rule that's before us right now, the housing rule. And also with the rule that's in front of us now, that we ask the parties to consider the conversation we have, a particular department, consider the conversation that's taken place, whether you might be amenable to making some modification to the rule as we've discussed. And if not, come prepared to defend that position. I see your hand up.
Yes, yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. I do want to make sure that we have sufficient time to gather the parties so we can have a meaningful conversation about any compromise. And the 8th is, number one, right around the corner. And I hate to even mention this, but Ms. Cota has been instrumental in making the modifications to this rule, and she has a pre-scheduled vacation. And I just want to make sure that we have enough time to get everyone back to the table and then reduce any changes to writing for the committee's consideration in time. Is there a possibility we could push this out to the following meeting, and then the department would grant any extension to the 45-day review period to the committee? And I think we might have to ask for an additional extension of the 8-month adoption deadline. But other than that, I think that might give all of us the adequate time and reasonable amount of time to do this work, especially since we're not looking to implement this rule until January 1st.
Next scheduled meeting is August 22. Committee members, thoughts about that? You shake your head. Does that mean you're okay?
Yes, I'm fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess, clarification, please. So, on the E rule that's in front of us, or C rule that's in front of us that don't have time to get to today, is that timely enough that we should meet in 2 weeks or just stick with our other schedule of August 20?
I hesitate to bring folks back for one rule.
Sure.
I understand it's a couple more weeks, but it is an emergency rule. It's in place already. And I do want to hear concerns and have that conversation, but I'm sure folks will disagree with this comment, but I think putting both rules on the 22nd makes a lot more sense than trying to split those two and do different things. So, I mean, we're all busy and, but in deference to the concerns, which I appreciate. I would like to do this 22nd and do both these rules on the 22nd. Everyone okay with that? Most everyone okay with that? Representative
I just want to make one comment on this rule. I heard one word today. I heard the word discipline with regard to the residents of these homes. And that sounds awfully Dickensian to me. Discipline is for children when you're trying to modify their behavior and are capable of modifying their behavior. I just want to say that I found the use of the word discipline somehow being in these rules are really scary. So I'm just going to leave it at that. And I hope it means something other than what it said. I heard that word today. Am I alone in hearing that word today? Yeah, you heard it. Yeah, we heard the word discipline with regard to, I think it was medication, possible medication. And I'm only just making the comment. I hope we can get rid of that word because I don't like any implication that comes with that as it relates to residents of homes.
If I may just quickly comment, that's a definition of a chemical restraint, which are prohibited by these rules. So we in no way condone the discipline of residents. So that's just that's a very important.
Okay, we're on the same page then. That's good. Thank you.
Yes, we're on the same page. Yes.
Okay, so Stuart will need an extension of the 45-day review. And then in addition to that, if you need to change the adoption period, you'll need to send us a request and what that request is.
Okay.
And we'll add that to the agenda.
Okay, would you like me to include the extension of your 45 days in my request, or is
The
that sufficient?
extension can just go to our committee assistant. But the adoption period is an action we'll have to take in this committee, so that'll be separate.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah, and I'm happy. Are you then not going to meet on the 8th, or?
We are not going to meet on the 8th.
Okay. Okay, I will submit the request for the extension to you folks.
Okay, and then draft a letter asking for us to consider the change in adoption period.
Great.
Okay.
I will actually send him the extension for him to sign when that day extension.
Great, thank you, Charlene.
For adoption then.
Thank you for everyone being amenable to working to get to the right place.
Well, thank you.
Any other business? Thanks to everyone that was here on the housing rule. I apologize. As I've said to many of you many times, sometimes things go very quickly and we have time left over, and sometimes they don't quite go the way we expect them to. That's the nature of it. And thank you very much in this meeting.